Hello there, my dear internet friends. I am not an expert, I'm just a nerd, but I'm here to be a nerd with you as we dive into the wonderful world of our history. So let's get started. The year is 2018 AD, and we start our story tonight in the midst of an almost totally alien landscape. And there's beautiful golden, orangey red peaks far ahead of us in the distance. Everything around us is very dry and arid, and there's certainly no water to be seen anywhere. And while the landscape we find ourselves in now is undeniably beautiful, it's also an inhospitable, desolate, and quite lonely place. Thankfully, we are not here alone. I am undeniably delighted to introduce to you K-Rex 2, or we'll just call him Rex, a highly advanced NASA technical rover designed, as you may have been able to guess, to explore the surface of Mars. And our friend Rex has been specially built and designed to handle the rugged extremes of this complicated extraterrestrial landscape. Rex can handle the extreme dryness and lack of water. He doesn't need a drink. He can handle the volcanoes, the huge towering volcanoes that spew forth noxious gas, and salt flats that stretch out almost as far as the eye can see in some places. And these are not just some shallow salt beds. We're talking a salt flat over 1,000 meters thick. That's over 3,300 feet for my American friends. This is a place it's almost impossible to imagine human beings living in, which is precisely why they need our friend Rex. Rex is here as part of a larger team from NASA called ARADS. It's headed by a researcher named Brian Glass. However, it's filled with scientists and engineers and researchers that have just been working on this project for a really long time, even at this point. And they are watching our friend Rex from a distance, of course, from a distance, as he makes his way along the ground and conducts his investigations. There is so much hope riding on our friend Rex and on the ARADS program in general. The whole point of this program is to try to find signs of life on Mars, almost certainly ancient life on Mars. But if we can learn more about how life could have evolved and lived on the harsh territory of the Red Planet, then we could probably find out a lot about how life can grow and adapt here on our own too. Millions of dollars had been poured into Rex, into the ARADS program at NASA to try to fund this research, to try to get further in these huge questions of how life emerges and how it can survive in harsh conditions and what we can learn from all this. There's so much hope riding on our friend Rex as he makes his way through that alien desert. And while I know NASA scientists aren't exactly making minimum wage and that everyone there would have been well compensated for the work, I also have to say, with the amount of time and effort and care that goes into making a rover like Rex, I feel like it goes beyond science. And especially with how smart some of the people on this team are, they could be working for some big commercial company anywhere, but they were there making Rex to go on his mission. Our Rex, our intrepid little robot explorer, now out on his great journey, I'm convinced they built him at least in part as a labor of love, because you don't get that far in robotics and the sciences if it's not something you have your whole heart in. It's their labor of love they're sending out on this journey of exploration, or I should say this practice journey of exploration, because as I'm sure many of you have guessed, we are not meeting up with our friend on Mars. No, we are joining them in their practice round with Rex in one of the most terrifying and harsh and incredibly extreme places that humanity has ever known of. And as smart as they are, I'm sure some of them must have known that not far away, as they stood in that harsh, hot desert of volcanoes and fumes and salt flats, that 7,000 years earlier, a culture would arise on the edge of that desert that was so beautiful and so ingenious and so sophisticated that they would flourish on the edge of that desert for 5,000 years, and changing very little in that entire time. They would also develop some 2 millennia before the Egyptians, a complex and intricate mummification process that would bear everlasting witness to both their deep devotion to family members in death and their firm belief and a very real afterlife awaiting them on the other side. These mummies are now the oldest known man-made mummies in the world. But not only that, they can tell us a huge, huge amount about how this incredible, amazing, groundbreaking culture lived their lives. So now it's time to learn about the guardians of the dead of the Atacama, and about the love and death of the Chinchorro. Hello, my name is Marie, and welcome to Lost Realms. Each episode, we look at a different city, place, or people that have been lost to us, whether through the destruction of a disaster, the ravages of climatic changes, the failure of governments, or the cruelty of neighbors. Each one of these wonderful places and people were taken from us forever. Some were wonderful and held what we would think of as the very best and brightest of humanity. Some were awful and could be considered part of the origin story of monsters. But all of them remain, regardless of their moral alignment, part of our collective human history, and all of them we attempt with love and understanding to get to know here. The Chinchorro people of ancient Chile fascinate for many reasons, and their mummies are only one, frankly. Their ability to survive and succeed for so long in such a harsh environment is frankly worthy of admiration on its own, and they deserve to be celebrated for their ingenuity and resiliency alone. But it is their mummies that have truly made this ancient people so famous in modern times, and it's easy to understand why. As I said, they are the oldest known made by human hands from anywhere in the world, and I must say they are truly striking to look at even now. And perhaps another reason that the mummies fascinate us so much is that they come from a culture that honestly we know very little about, shamefully little about. The Chinchorro did not develop a writing system that we know of, and so the remains of their relatives that they've left this way through mummification, as well as the remains left by them living their day-to-day lives, are truly our best way to get to know this incredibly successful civilization. Again, remember, they survived in one form for over 5,000 years. 5,000 years. As I record this, in the fall of 2024, America has existed for 248 years. And while people have inhabited Great Britain for millennia, frankly, the nation-state of Great Britain has only been around since 1707. The Egyptian Empire that I brought up earlier, and who is so famous for their own mummification, they were an incredibly successful civilization, but even they only lasted for 3,000 years. Only. But you get my point. Even the ancient Egyptians, on their best day, only got a little over half as far as our Chinchorro people did. Not that it's a competition, but just, my goodness, 5,000 years. How? How did they do it? And especially in one of the most complicated, harsh, inhospitable, and may I just say at times frightening landscapes on Earth. How? How did they do that? In ancient days, how? And how, on top of all this, did they make these wonderful, beautiful remains of their dearly beloved and make them in such a way that they have survived down to us in the present day? We're going to learn about Chinchorro culture from what we know of its earliest emergence all the way down to its latest artifacts found. We're going to do a deep dive into the mummification process that these people used to take care of their departed and produce the amazing mummies that we see today. And see if after all this we can't figure out a little bit better how the Chinchorro people managed to be both so practically successful and spiritually unique. But this is a world of heat and stone, of beautiful creatures and terrifying natural forces. So if we're going to try to understand the Chinchorro people as best we're able, we need to start with the history of the Atacama Desert. The Atacama Desert is a fascinating and mysterious place in its own right. Though it doesn't look as impressive on a world map as it does in person. It's a rather thin stretch of land that only measures around 600 to 700 miles, or 1,000 kilometers, going north to south, wedged between the Pacific Ocean and two great mountain chains, the Andes and the Cordillera de Costa. The desert itself makes up a good chunk of the modern-day nation of Chile, but it also stretches and extends into several other countries, such as Bolivia, Argentina, and Peru. I mentioned volcanoes to you earlier, and the Atacama is home to several geysers and other types of volcanic activity. Perhaps the most striking, though, is Ojos de Salado, which is the highest active volcano found anywhere in the world. And it's a formidable sight, standing at an astounding 22,569 feet above sea level, or 6,879 meters. And its beautiful crater lake is the highest body of water anywhere in the world too, and understandably this whole volcanic region of the Atacama is incredibly fascinating to scientists. And if we expand our gaze outward and look at the whole body of the desert, we can see that it's made up of different varying extremes and landscapes. There are areas that sport the classic desert sand dune, but many more where rock and pebble are much more common underfoot. The beautiful mountains everywhere nearby are also the great curse of the Atacama. They trap rain clouds and contribute greatly, along with cold currents running through the Pacific nearby, to the lack of rain and extreme dryness here. And it's been dry here for a very, very, very long time. The Atacama is widely believed to be the oldest desert on Earth, having had these similar conditions now for over 150 million years. And the center of the desert, the most arid and barren spot, literally referred to as the hyper-arid center, has been that way for at least 15 million years. And when I say hyper-arid, I mean exceptionally hyper-arid. In fact, these regions are so desolate that initial studies done here by NASA and others detected no signs of life. And even today, using the most modern analysis, the only life found in these hyper-arid spots is of the microbial variety. Literally just incredibly hardy strains of bacteria and fungi that live a few feet below the Earth's surface. And of course, the reason that life finds it so difficult here in these hyper-arid regions is not just the lack of water, but also the heat. At its worst, the temperatures here can soar to above 50 degrees Celsius or over 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And at nights and in some places, it can even get quite cold. These extremes in temperatures only add to the difficulty of trying to live here. And it can be difficult to imagine how the first humans arriving to this region could have managed to eke out a living at all. But the first people to arrive here in the Atacama were clever and adaptable. They didn't bother trying to live in the worst, harshest parts at the center of the desert. Instead, they stuck near the coast, congregating too on the banks of rivers that flowed down from the mountains into the Pacific. In these fertile natural oases, plants, animals, and humans could find ways to live comfortably. The sea's cold currents that help inhibit rainfall also encourage abundant marine life. So abundant, in fact, that a small community could make a living just entirely off the sea if they wanted, and that is precisely what these early inhabitants did. Though the exact origins of the ancestors of the Chinchorro people is still something of a mystery. Different historians have put forth different viewpoints. Early scholars thought that they might have been Amazonian in origin, moving from the tropical forests to the coast of the Pacific, probably as migrant hunter-gatherers. And certainly at some Chinchorro sites, there have been Amazonian-style artifacts recovered, but these appear relatively later on, not near the origins of the Chinchorro. And for this and other reasons, this theory is disputed somewhat today. And most historians seem to think today that they either started out as A, highland migrant hunters that came down and switched to a mainly marine-based diet and economy just based off of the needs of the time, or they could have been early inhabitants of Peru who migrated down to the edges of the Atacama for similar reasons. And this is the view that currently has the most acceptance. But regardless of how they got there, the early ancestors of what we know of as the Chinchorro people would arrive here at a spectacularly early date. And while we've been focusing mostly on the Chilean part of the Atacama Desert until now, it's worth noting that these people, the Chinchorro, were not just found here, and part of the reason many think now that they may have originated in Peru is some of the earliest sites have been found in southern Peru and the edge of the Atacama. These remains date back to around 11,000 years ago, and they are staggeringly important and beautiful to us today. And we do actually see here some precursors to our later famous Chinchorro mummies, though prepared more simply and differently, and indeed the tools and objects here found are a little simpler. Again, these are remains and artifacts from 11,000 years ago, and we are seeing a culture at its emergence. But already we see here that these people have become successful enough in their environment to have the resources to perform elaborate burials like this and to make beautiful tools like this. And going forward, these people would only continue to advance in sophistication. By 9,000 years ago, the people that we would now call the Chinchorro had started to settle down on the coast of the Atacama. But by the coast, in these areas I mentioned in particular where rivers would meet the ocean, the Chinchorro people would develop a sedentary lifestyle, giving up the migratory hunter-gatherer lifestyles of their ancestors. Here they would become expert artisans and craftsmen of amazing tools, some of which you're seeing here, most of which relate to marine harvesting. And modern stable isotope analysis of the hair and human remains of the ancient Chinchorro people have shown that up to 90% of their diet was made up of things that came from the sea, with the remaining 10% being split pretty evenly between terrestrial animals and vegetation. That's incredible if you think about it. 90% of their diet came from the ocean in some way. And they were master fishermen, skilled harpoonists, and again, just amazing craftsmen. Some of these tools are both functional and incredibly beautiful. There's not all that much fresh water in general in the Atacama. If you found a good spot with good clean water and near to the coast with the fish and everything else, then you had all you needed. As I've said, the Chinchorro people occupied this area continuously for over 5,000 years. It's only really late that we see them adopt any farming practices at all. For an incredibly long time, they simply didn't seem to need such things. Their population seems to have been a relatively stable one as well, and they must have been extremely good at what they were doing to succeed here so long. In fact, not only do they occupy the same sites for 5,000 years, they even have the same cemetery in use for well over 3,000 years. And in terms of what their day-to-day life looked like, we're still piecing together how that could have gone. We've only uncovered a very few amount of habitational sites so far, and this could partly be because they tended to build very light housing structures. They seem to have lived in small groups of huts, which were probably covered with leather or mats, with a total population size of each group of probably between 30 to 50 individuals. It's also possible too, as time went on, since they inhabited the same sites, that their old housing structures may have been covered by trash middens, large heaps of debris and detritus and just garbage from their lives. These are very common at sites throughout the ancient world and are actually really helpful because they can tell us a lot about their diet and how they're living. But oftentimes in ancient cultures, these trash middens or dumps can end up on top of places where people used to live. But excavations are still ongoing. It's worth noting too that some of the relatively later sites, and by later I still mean well over 4,800 years old, they have found semi-subterranean structures built into the ground. And then about 3,830 years ago, these start to become more elaborate with vertical stone walls and deliberate semicircular floors. And all of this can tell us a great deal about the ancient Chinchorro lifestyle. But of course, what can tell us even more about how they lived their lives is what has made these people so famous, and that is how they treated their dead. And this mummification process and the human remains left from it can tell us not just a lot about how they viewed the great beyond, but more importantly, I think, how they viewed each other and their families and friends. However, before we go any further, I have to make a couple things really clear. Until now, I've focused on the skill and ingenuity of the Chinchorro people because it's truly impressive, and they were really successful. But that doesn't mean that they didn't still face challenges. Due to climatic changes, particularly one that occurred around 6,000 years ago, the people would have to sometimes still give up their sedentary lifestyle and move around. And especially in times of scarcity, but even in general, there's, again, not a lot of fresh water in the Atacama. All too often, they would have had to protect their territory from invaders. And several scholars in recent publications have pointed out that for a large chunk of their history, they would have had relatively little positive contact with other outside groups. Some trade, but not a lot. They would have to stand firm as a group to protect their rich but limited patch of livable land. And so as we go forward, I want you to keep that in mind, that even in the background of just the harshness of the landscape, and even with the climatic challenges that I mentioned to you that they could face, on top of all this, they might have to face very human enemies as well. In the face of all these challenges, though of course we all have a deep connection to our departed loved ones, I think you can see the kind of comfort and sense of cultural and familial identity that could come from keeping one's loved ones close after death and keeping them maintained in such a way that it was easy for you to visit them, to see them still, and for them to see you. This was a time before photographs, after all, or even, photorealistic paintings or whatever. All the cemeteries we found for the Chinchorro people were located very close to where they lived. And the mummies that we'll be discussing and talking about in detail here in a moment, all of them were created and maintained with the idea of being on display, but not in some sort of profitable sense, but instead in this harsh land that we've been discussing. Again, it was to visit, to receive and give love. There would have been so much hope riding on every single one of these mummies. And as we go now and look into every step of this mummification process, I think we'll see too that this process was not an act of devotion alone, but also something that revealed a vast and highly scientific medical knowledge and a level of anatomical skill almost unknown in the ancient world. The Chinchorro culture existed for so long in the same area that its history itself is broken into several chronological time periods, and the mummies that they made are broken into distinctive types based off the different materials they used at different time periods in their history. All cultures change and adapt over time, and the peoples living in them change too. Their beliefs change, and we see that with the history of the Chinchorro people and their mummies. And over the course of their 5,000-year history, the people's ways of treating their dead would change as well, as is natural for anywhere. Bearing all this in mind, scholars have broken up the types of mummies found at Chinchorro sites into several categories, the most predominant being the black mummies, the red mummies, the bandaged mummies, and the mud-coated mummies. In general, these names come from how the mummies are prepared. The black mummies, which are the oldest man-made mummies in the world, get their name from the black pigments applied to their funerary masks, for example. I specify man-made because most historians now feel that the Chinchorro mummies, as made by the Chinchorro people themselves, were based off naturally occurring mummies. The very dry and salty landscape of Chile, of the Atacama Desert, lends itself to preserving bodies. And there are even older mummies than those made by the Chinchorro that we have found that were just naturally created by the elements. And this isn't unique to here. There are naturally occurring mummies all over the world. Perhaps some of the most famous are the peat bog people, who, due to the nature of the chemicals in these bogs, were almost perfectly preserved. Likewise, here in the Atacama, for millennia before the Chinchorro started mummifying people, they would have almost certainly seen their dead being preserved just by the nature around them. Over time, this evolved into their complex mummification process. But even bearing this in mind, with the earliest mummies, the black mummies, it's still a very in-depth process. These mummies appear done in this style, this black mummy style, across various different sites and across a large chunk of time, roughly between 7,000 to 4,800 years ago, showing a cohesive spiritual identity and practice in regards to their dead by this people. This was not just something done once in a while. This was a unified idea, a unified funerary practice. One thing that we haven't discussed either is just who's being mummified. In most ancient cultures that we see, again, we can jump to ancient Egypt, for example, it's the kings and the other members of the aristocracy that get the full process of mummification, while commoners might get a poor man's version or more likely nothing at all. And this is very, very common throughout the ancient world. It's the rich, the so-called great and good, that get the truly fancy mortuary processes. But not so with the Chinchorro. Even at their very earliest sites, everyone gets the full treatment. Men, women, young, old, even infants, even stillborn children. We have truly found mummified fetuses at Chinchorro sites. Every single person, regardless of their status or wealth or background, seems to have been treated more or less the same. It's actually hard to tell how society was structured amongst these people. It's kind of still a unknown area to us because they treated their dead with such egalitarian care. In fact, some scholars that I found online noted that it's the children's graves and the babies' graves that seem to have the most care and the most love given to them, which I know must make sense in one way, but on another is extremely unusual in the ancient world. But I think it's very beautiful and very, very human too. Especially, again, considering the many challenges they would have faced in their day-to-day life, this rugged landscape, the other peoples. I think in times of struggle, we all cling to our families and loved ones a little bit tighter. And if we look at the step-by-step process of how these black mummies were constructed, then we can see even clearer both their love and their skilled care. The ancient morticians would have first removed the flesh from the body, carefully removing the skin as well as all hair, and then the bodies would be left buried or perhaps exposed to the elements until all soft tissue was removed. Bodily exhumation and bone cleaning and display have been reported by many different cultures around the world, so we should not think of this as something uncommon. And this process of the removal of soft tissue and organs through exposure and at times outright defleshing is usually tied up into different ritual and ceremony rites throughout the world. So we could probably think of this point, though it's a little morbid, as an important part of the grieving process, a sort of liminal space between the person actually dying and the person actually being ready to move on. After this grisly but necessary work was completed, the bones would be carefully washed and probably dried in the sun. And then once the bones were ready, funerary technicians of the time would carefully reconstruct the body, reconstruct the skeleton perfectly. They clearly had great anatomical knowledge. And when reassembling it all, they would attach with it sticks and reeds and tie it all together with cordage to make the whole thing stiff and kind of sturdy. With the skull then fixed on top, the whole skeleton, the whole body would be reunited at last, but this was not the end of the process. The figure of bones and sticks and reeds and cords would then be laid out, and the ancient mortician would then proceed to cover it all with a thick gray mud, a clay. Straw at times would be used to fill in bodily cavities, and clay put over top of that until eventually a full form of the original person could be made. Facial features would even be carefully carved as well, as you've seen, as well as the private parts of the individual people. Wigs of human hair were then carefully attached on the top, and in the case of babies and children, the wigs were later found to have been made of adult hair, perhaps of family members close to them. And if we stand back now and look at what they have created, which is not even completed yet, we can see that they have crafted a sturdy, long-lasting, physically accurate representation of a departed family member, a departed loved one, a departed friend. And now the mummy could proceed to get its final dressing. Now parts of the original skin of the person would sometimes be applied. The morticians would then coat the body all over in a blue-black paste which would stain the clay black, again giving it its name. And sometimes this blue-black paste was applied very thickly so as to enhance facial features. And at this time, the mummification process would be more or less complete. The body would be dressed and swaddled in clothes and would then be presented to the community. This would have been a healing process and almost certainly an emotional one, and especially in the case of the fetuses that I told you about and of small children. But it also would have allowed them to see their loved one again in a beautiful handmade form, and a form that they could visit again and again. And in some cultures, even today, we know they sometimes bring these loved ones home with them at certain times of the year or for certain festivals. This process of taking care of their dead would also have allowed their dead to take care of them a little bit, I think. Though the dead would still have gotten the rest too. They always seem to have been interred in the cemetery region with their backs facing the ocean, looking inwards towards their community, and they would be tended to often. The open eyes and mouths of the mummies were clearly meant to convey a sense of life and hope, of communication, and now preserved as they were, they could be visited by their family over and over again. As I said, this form of mummification would remain popular with the Chinchorro people for a very, very long time. Although around 4,800 years ago, things start to change. For the past 3,000 years, the process that I just shared with you had gone on more or less unchanged. However, around this time, we start to see the mummy's appearance altered drastically. These newer mummies, called the red mummies, seem to have been easier to make than the older ones, and had a distinct, unique process. Morticians collected first many natural items from the area, items that seemed to have held special significance for them, and also that seemed to have served practical purposes, such as long poles and dry grass and reeds, but also feathers from seabirds such as pelicans and seagulls, and many different camelid fibers. They also collected large amounts of red ochre, which would be ground and made into a paste. And now, instead of waiting for nature to deflesh the body for them, the morticians would work directly on it, cutting in and taking out the organs and all other soft tissue. The head would also be removed from the rest of the body. And after all of this, the whole bodily cavity would be dried, most likely using hot coals. Then those long poles I mentioned were placed inside the body and provide skeletal structure. And finally, all those bodily cavities were restuffed with the feathers and camelid fibers I mentioned and other things. Then all the incisions were stitched back together. The heads were treated completely differently as well. They were given a very long wig made with locks of human hair. The wig was attached with a paste, and the wig itself was painted red. From this point on, it got treated a similar way to the black mummies, where they would use different pastes to replicate the facial features in clay. And though they would end up usually still in the end making the face black, the whole rest would normally be red, making a strong visual statement of spiritual power. However, this mummification process didn't seem to stick around as long as the black mummies did. After the red mummy style first appears around 4,800 years ago, it disappears around 4,000 years ago. After that, other newer styles would continue to emerge. The bandaged mummies came after and were a variation of the red mummies, which instead of having their skin reattached, would have bandages instead. And after that, by around 3,000 years ago, we start to see corded mummies, where the mummies are just entirely wrapped in cords. And after this, the use of mummification by the Chinchorro people seems to slowly decline altogether. After the corded mummies come the mud mummies. These are bodies that were just more or less covered in mud. And after that, they seem to have moved on to different funerary practices altogether. And the Chinchorro people themselves never really vanished or anything. Their culture was never wiped out in any great big annihilation. They too just over time changed. And I mean, after living there for 5,000 years, nothing wrong with trying something new. And a lot of this ancient period is still really murky to us. But one thing that is clear is that these people would have a profound and lasting impact on all the other cultures that would arise in this part of the world for millennia to come. And I should say, not just on the people to arise in this part of the world. The Chinchorro culture was placed on the UNESCO World Heritage Convention list for protection in 2021. This was after locals on their own, for years, had been working hard to protect the remains of the people here. Many of the invaluable artifacts, and more importantly, the mummies themselves, have been placed in horrible danger both from looting and from the elements, as this area has been facing rising humidity in recent years, which is thought to be linked to climate change, which is causing the mummies to decompose faster. This may sound extreme or overdramatic, and it shocked me at first too, but apparently there's been lots of flash flooding in the Atacama recently that they haven't had to deal with before. This has put the mummies that are still out there at considerable risk. Local teams of volunteers have taken to scouring the desert and reburying any bodies that they come across. They don't have enough money to house them all in the local museums, and there's nothing really else they can do other than try to cover them up with dirt again. It's been a heartbreaking process for many of the people trying to protect these remains, especially for the locals who understandably feel very proud and connected to the Chinchorro heritage. However, with the site recently receiving that UNESCO status, and with a chance of governmental setbacks being eliminated after Chile recently changed its constitution for the first time in a very long while, there is still so much hope riding on just the idea of a brighter tomorrow, of a brighter future for these mummies. And honestly, that's the same hope that humans have used to sustain themselves in this desert for millennia. It's the same hope that led to those NASA people creating our friend Rex. And I know everything I just said is very, very cheesy, but that doesn't stop it from being true or wonderful. And if I'm being honest, even with all of the challenges ahead of them, I still can't help but feel optimistic for the future. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's nice. That means it's both the end of our time here today and the end of our story. And thank you so much for being here for the story of the Chinchorro people. And as always, when I say that, I'm not just thanking you for your viewership, but for your curiosity, your empathy, and your humanity. Because if you have an interest in history, then that means that you do have all these qualities. And I'm very happy that you do. Whenever we dive into the crazy world of our history, we can see things that alarm us, or confuse us, or even make us angry. But if we're feeling anything about our history at all, then I think that that means it matters to us, and I think that that's beautiful. If you found yourself particularly interested in our topic today, please don't let my words be the only words you hear on the Chinchorro. Just like always, you'll find a full source list for today's episode in the top comment below. But please don't stop there. And a really nice place to look up the stuff on that source list could be at your local library. They might have a book on ancient Chile. They might have a book on something weird. Just something totally unrelated that you would read and love and be like, oh wow, thank you, Marie. Thank you for making me go to the library. And I'll be like, you're welcome. So, yeah, you should probably go. Also, be sure to keep an eye out for the Chinchorro Lost Bits episode. Lost Bits is a companion series I run on my channel, and it's a place for me to get to know you better, to answer your questions, and to share interesting and cool bits of information I find while researching these main episodes. The Lost Bits episodes typically come out a few days after these main videos, so once it's ready, I'll put a link right up here, and if that sounds like your thing, then keep an eye out. Also, if you like today's story, I feature new long-form content every single week on lost and mysterious people and places from our past. So if you don't want to miss anything, please consider subscribing. But either way, thank you again so much for being here. And until next time, be safe, be happy, go with all my love, and goodbye.